Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the latest edition of FreeThought Hour. This is a show where we have a guest to interview, and unfortunately, tonight our guest will be late. He's stuck in traffic. Never mind, I've got my co-host to talk to. Welcome, Tercia. How the devil are you?
Hello, John. Well, I told you that the gods of sport were not on the side of South Africans today. You informed me that we lost the cricket and we lost the rugby against Australia. So, but I'm fine. So I'm fine. Thank you.
Just tell our audience who South Africa lost the cricket to.
It's a little island nation, sort of, some people who call themselves Brits or something like that. Yes, the UK, United Kingdom beat us. A proper thrashing, if I'm correct.
It wasn't Britain. It wasn't the United Kingdom. It was England.
It was England.
Yes.
See, it was England. I don't know if that's better or worse.
Well, you're right. It was a proper thrashing, and because we beat you by a whole innings. But that's only fair because guess what happened last time we met? You beat us by a whole innings, or almost a whole innings by 10 wickets and a few runs.
Was this the short format of the game, John? I that's how much I follow sport.
No. This is the proper game. This is test cricket. Yeah, okay. This is the one where I think it's the only game in the world where the players stop for meals.
Yes. I did send you a little piece that Bill Bryson wrote about cricket. It's a funny game, as are most sports. Shall we discuss sports philosophically while we wait for our guest, John?
Well, I've got some thoughts about philosophy to bring to this show, but since we don't have our guests at the moment, let's use this opportunity to plug our next shows, shall we?
Let's do that before we get all philosophical.
Yes, indeed. Yes, because just finished, in fact, has been this week's Global Atheist News that goes out on the hour, whereas this show comes at the half hour. So whatever time zone you're in, Global Atheist News, you've missed it. It went out half an hour ago. It started. And so that's our weekly Global Atheist News. It's a report on how the theists of the world impact humanity, how they impacted humanity over the previous 7 days. But then we also have Global Atheist News Review, don't we? Because the news itself is just factual, no opinions. We try and keep it that way. It's difficult to stop rolling the eyes sometimes. But the Global Atheist News Review is the panel show, which you're a member of, Tercia, and you chaired it on one occasion when I was unavailable, admirably. And that's where we have a group of 4 or 5, maybe 6 opinionated people who give their views on the news that we've just reported on. And in addition to all of that, of course, we have the weekly FreeThought Hour, and it's scheduled about a month in advance. So tonight we have Lewis Howeth when he gets out of his traffic jam. Next week, we have the return of Pastor Alan Cartwright, who was our guest about a month ago, but he's contacted me and said we were too kind. We were too soft on him. He wants a more conflicting encounter. So he is preparing a PowerPoint of his position, and we're going to screen that, and we're going to do our best to critique it, criticize it, some critical thinking.
I'm looking forward to that one because I really enjoyed that conversation, and as a very well catechized, is there a word such as catechized? I mean, I did a very thorough catechism. So I underwent a very thorough catechism from the age of 6 until the age of 17, and then later as well. So I do. It's a. I'm fairly knowledgeable. One doesn't forget what was drilled into one's brain since the age of 6. So
yeah. Well, that's why the Jesuits say, "Give me a child of 8, and I'll show you the man," or "Give me a boy of 8, and I'll show you the man." Yeah, they all want to get us young when we're vulnerable. Indeed.
yes.
Yeah.
So I'll do my best to be a little bit more mean, because actually I'm a really nice person, as you know yourself.
No, we have to act. We have to pretend to be mean.
I have to be mean.
Yes, yes. So you're what would you say, a catechismist?
No, I don't like the ist, because that means that I still believe it. So I was
A former catechismist.
possibly, yes, because I mean, I know the catechism very well, and with catechism I not only refer to the teachings of Calvin. I don't know what you know about the catechism, but there are 52. The whole Christian Reformed doctrine is divided into 52 Sundays, and we had to learn those off by heart. So we would literally go in. When you're 6, you start with a very simple version, and by the time you're 17, you've done it at least 10 times, because you really do the whole thing in the period of a year. So I'm very well catechized. Sounds a bit like chastised, which is very much the same type of thing.
Okay, so an ex-catechismist, and so what happens, of course, is that with something that is non-evidential, like a faith, the only way you can instill it into a congregation of people is by iteration, reiteration. So that's why, in my personal view, the religions have all grasped the calendar with glee and divided it up into events that they can say, look, this shows, this is evidence that our belief is correct.
Exactly, and if one looks at how popular repeating words and phrases are in all religions, and nowadays it's actually a bit. To me, it's very sad that more people are not taught the catechism as part of their religious experience in churches, but I understand why churches don't do it, because it's actually really quite boring. Good evening, Dean. That's why people don't learn it anymore. But I think it's really important, because there's a lot to unpack there, and I think if more people knew the catechism, well, there'd be fewer Christians than they are. I'm convinced of that. But even the more evangelical churches, the repetition of certain phrases in the songs they sing, and the creed. And it's really important to keep repeating those phrases. And it's amazing how it sticks. I mean, I've been an atheist now for more than 10 years, and I can still say the creed off by heart after 10 years. So it works.
Amen to that. Well, you're absolutely right. The repetition, the getting them young, and of course it harks back to a day when the world ran at a slower pace. There was less competition for our attention, far less entertainment, and going to a church and chanting together was probably a good time.
Well, I don't think, I think there's enough evidence that it's probably still we still experience chanting together with other people as having a good time. It's just that nowadays we prefer to do that next to the cricket field, or the cricket pitch, or at the soccer or football or rugby. But that idea of chanting the same thing together with other people is very much part of our evolutionary development.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And religion taps into all the best and worst attributes of nature, doesn't it?
Yes. Well, it's a social animal thing, isn't it? I mean, even wolves howl together for
It
bonding the
feels so
community.
good. So
Mm.
go. So after Pastor Alan, who's our next guest? John, I don't have
Mm.
it in front of me.
I can tell you, it's your ex-minister winemaker, ex-minister turned winemaker character. He sounds very interesting to me. I mean, presumably he doesn't just make what's it called, sacramental wine.
Oh no, no, he sells his wine internationally, and he has uh, received some prizes, and he makes excellent wine. He's one of the few people in South Africa he makes makes use of quite unusual or more rare varieties, like
Oh
the
no. You're not going to
not
tell
just.
me you're not going to tell me it's eye of frog and bat's blood, I hope.
No, 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 no. He has a very good Columbar, and he was one of the first people winemakers in South Africa to start making the wine of the Columbar variety. So
Mhm.
he doesn't only do the typical Pinotage and
Mhm.
Shiraz, and he makes a
Yeah.
very good wine. But he's also very interesting, very knowledgeable about the Bible, and he was. For at least 20 years, he was the pastor of a congregation in the northwest of the country, which is
Mhm.
the mining area. So he
Yes.
actually has a very interesting life story as well.
Mhm.
Um, uh, interesting chap. Yep, I'm
Did
looking
you
forward
know?
to that.
Yeah, indeed. I was going to ask you whether he makes red or white wine, or maybe both.
Both,
Mhm.
both. Yes.
While you were here, one of the places I didn't take you to is our local wine vineyard. We've got one just across the road. You know, we drove both
Okay.
today because I live on the coast, and for the benefit of viewers, and so you can't go south. Well, you can walk 10 minutes to the sea, and that's it. And so you can go north, east, or west from here. And slightly to the east, we have High Down Vineyard, which makes a lovely white wine. Only
Hmm.
unfortunately, it's going to pack up shop and the land is going to be turned into a housing estate.
That is a loss. That is a loss for mankind. Something interesting about South Africa. Well, it's actually only the Western Cape. The prime wine region of the country is not allowed to sell any wines on Sundays. So
Oh,
on
yeah,
Sundays, one is not allowed to buy any wine. The I think even liquor stores are shut, and
yeah,
supermarkets that sell wine have to cover those shelves.
yeah.
But it's
We,
a
we used to have that here up until, when was it? Must have been about the 1970s. Lord's Day observance, shop regulations we had.
it's only in the Western Cape that we still have that. Other parts of South Africa doesn't have that anymore. So I don't know why. Maybe they think we have enough access to wine. We deserve one day of rest. So you can just stock up on Saturday for Sunday. So which is that's what makes it extra pointless, don't you think?
Well, our enlightenment was several decades ago now. So hopefully
Yeah.
you'll catch up one day.
Well, I'll just make sure that I'm stocked up on Saturdays so that I have enough
Yes,
for Sunday.
yes. So our guest still hasn't arrived. And I was going to broach this topic of philosophy with you now, because as you know, I'm a retired science teacher. I never studied philosophy. I've got an interest in it. And of course, I recognize the value of logic and rational thinking, because that's how we come up with hypotheses that we can investigate scientifically. We do it by thought. And we also use logic and rational thinking for constructing, designing the investigations. You know, we think we've got to have a control to show that it isn't that, if that cause, we've got to have another control to show that, and we try and eliminate all the alternative causes so that the only cause of the effect is the the cause that we're investigating for. And that is all about rational thinking. And that's really, in my mind, before the real scientific bit happens, because the scientific bit is the investigation, looking for observations that are congruent or not with whatever the proposition was. So what worries me is that people who have majored in philosophy, they go through all that useful process of learning how to do thinking, the best thinking, and then they think they've finished. You know, they go through the syllogism or whatever method they're using, and they come to an outcome, which they call a conclusion. I wouldn't use that word because I don't think they've finished. But they do. They think that they've proved something, and that's the end to it, and they stop there. And this is because they're stuck in a pre-Renaissance mindset, because back in the Renaissance, philosophers realized that you can't think your way out of a paper bag. You know, you have to test the outcome of your reasoning, the inference, as I would call it, for a match with the natural realm. And that's one of my big beefs with philosophers. Now, I'm generalizing, but of course, a lot of philosophers, professional philosophers, A.C. Grayling, for example, they know that. They know that thought is just thought, and you've really got to go on and investigate whether your thinking is correct or not. But unfortunately, a lot of the theists that I bump into on social media, they don't know that.
Yes, and I would like to add to your view of philosophers, and once again, remember that this is a generalization, because sometimes we have to speak in terms of generalizations. Because if we were to discuss every single case of anything individually, obviously we wouldn't get anywhere. So, having watched a number of philosophers, sorry, I have to comment on Dean, because that's what I actually want to come to.
Yes, it's great. I've never met the word philosophabble before, but I love it. Thanks, Dean.
I love that. I love that, philosophabble. And I wonder, when do we cross the threshold into mental masturbation? And I find that often when I listen to philosophers, because it's almost as if, especially professional philosophers, get so stuck in some kind of metaphysic that they fall into philosophabble. And it ties into with what you're saying. You lose all contact with reality. You know, in South Africa, we have this beautiful expression. Directly translated, it means where the tacky hits the tar. So the tacky is this where the running shoe hits the tar. And no matter what you do, no matter how you think, you will always, as long as we live in this physical world, you will get to that point where there's a tacky or a running shoe hits the tar.
Yes.
And my worry about philosophy is, oh, here is Lewis, just when I'm saying what I'm worried about.
No, it's okay. I was actually having trouble for a while with my camera and my microphone as well, so I kept trying to restart my computer and everything. So luckily it's working now. So sorry about that.
Well done. And welcome. Yes, I saw you because when you tried to join, you come up in my backstage, and I saw you having difficulty, and I didn't bring you on until you obviously sorted it. And
yeah,
now
that's great. Thank you.
And hear you, and this is great. Well done. So thank you for coming.
No, it's great to be here. Thank you for having us.
So, Lewis, the first thing that we normally do with our victims, guests, is we ask them how they became the person they are today. Now, I know that you had, what shall I say, successes under disappointment in your life so far.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah? Would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah, the disappointment to start with, the bad news, I think, was primarily the loss of my PhD supervision. That was somewhat disheartening. my supervisor was made redundant. So through no fault of my own, I was essentially unable to be supervised for my PhD because the university was unable to fulfill that role. So I've been forced to seek supervision elsewhere or restart my PhD. It's not a top priority for me at the minute anyway, because I'm devoting me time to sort of education online, which I see is very pressing in general anyway. It seems that the philosophical space online is very lacking. There's some very great academics online, whether it's journals or even lectures that can be found. But you've got to know what to look for. You've got to know who to look for, and it's certainly not aimed at the broader public. And that's something that I'm trying to engage in, especially at a time when I think that the incommensurability between parties within the political space that we're in today is almost unbridgeable. And I would say that we're living in a moral calamity, which is an animal genocide. In which animals are killed by the billions. So I see a very pressing need for philosophy and ethics specifically within contemporary society, and I do hope to bring that around.
Well, tonight I would like to focus on your philosophical interest and your return to Christianity. I know you're keen to talk about veganism as well, but can we do that another time, maybe?
Oh yeah, that would be absolutely fine.
It's worth a whole show, surely, isn't it?
yeah, 100%. I think with me return to Christianity, I was actually raised a Catholic. I was raised in a Catholic family. I went to church. I went through me. Obviously, I was baptized. I went through me Holy Communion, and I've been confirmed. And then after my confirmation, I would say I had troubles with my faith more than anything, coinciding with philosophy. I started studying philosophy at university. And then that led me to question not necessarily the existence of a creator, but my knowledge of a creator's existence. It was more of an epistemological issue as I saw it. I thought that the affirmation or like the positive and negative of the belief as equally valid anyway, because of the responses that were made to Anthony Flew. I don't know if you're aware of, let's say, the parable of the partisan and the stranger, or the parable of the celestial city. So I thought that you could basically sit on either side, specifically with the parable of the partisan and the stranger, since there's no evidence either way, or there seems to be an inability to find evidence either way. I thought that it was essentially a question of faith, and at that time I was, faithful. I believed in God, and it was rational, and I would argue it was a rational position to have. But what really started to cause me to question my belief was actually other theists. It was really the via negativa, and the notion that we could only talk about God in the negative. And it seemed to me that there was an epistemological issue with affirming anything of a God that you would consider simple, if he was divine in his divine simplicity, which is a very strong argument, really devoting to the way in which we would engage with the God. It seems that I wouldn't be able to affirm anything of a God and say, or even affirm what is God, and only affirm what isn't God. And so I became an agnostic in the literal sense. I thought that we couldn't speak of God in a way which was meaningful. I thought that we couldn't move past raw faith into a position of rational belief, into a justified true belief on God, specifically because we wouldn't have anything to obtain to, or have any measures to obtain.
Interesting. Now, you've introduced a number of fairly technical words, which, for the benefit of our audience, I would like to explain. You used epistemology, which is the study of how we know things, and you used well, what was the other one? I should have written it down.
Ontology.
Well, that you didn't. I don't think you used ontology, but that's
I say like I said ontological, I think.
They're doing okay. Well, that's the study of being, isn't it? The existence, and then you talked about evidence. There was another word that I really wanted to explain, but I forgot what it was.
There was a term that I'm not. There was a term that I'm not familiar with myself, and that is the was it via negativa?
Yeah, via negativa was a movement essentially in which it basically goes as follows: you can't talk about God in the positive; you can only talk about God in the negative because of his perfection, because you'd be attributing something to God which was imperfect. And if you attribute something to God that's imperfect, then you would take away from his perfection. And so it simply could not be God. So all I could talk about is what isn't God, rather than affirm what actually is God. And these were theists that actually came up with this, but this caused me to question my faith more than anything.
So Lewis, can I ask, what would you present as evidence for God?
I would probably say that God is necessary rather than contingent. I would argue that God is necessary in relation to logic, and so I would say that if we look towards the foundations of reality, I think that we see it as truth, and what I would see as truth isn't necessarily without giving you a history lesson, I don't see a separation between ontology and epistemology as valid. I think that they're actually the same thing. I don't think that we should even separate the fields. And this is a position held by a philosopher called Hegel. And it's an argument that is outlined in his book, The Science of Logic. And within the science of logic, he outlines how there is an indubitability to a certain logical foundation, which is the relationship between actuality and possibility. And this relates to how it builds up into more complex notions of truth.
Right.
To save you a 600-word novel, the foundation of the belief is what's called idealism. So I would argue that we can't affirm a simple realism, and that this is being shown by the philosopher Immanuel Kant, and that from a post-Kantian perspective, that we should look towards the categories of understanding, or the concepts of what makes a thing what it is, to be imbued within reality itself. And I would say that was an aspect of the divine mind. So the divine mind is reality finding itself.
Right. Can I come in there? Because you have revealed that you have an entirely different concept of evidence from me. You think that arguing that something is necessary rather than contingent is evidence. I don't. I think that evidence consists of shareable, repeatable, independently observed observations in the natural realm.
So do I.
And you can't do that for dividing necessary from contingent beings. In fact, I would say that there's no evidence for anything necessary. As far as we know, so far, we've examined a lot of universe and we haven't found anything necessary. We've only found contingent things.
Have we? Would you say that's the case? So if I was to say 1 + 1 = 2, you'd say that's contingent?
I would say that isn't real. I would say that numbers are concepts, the numbers are abstracts, and they don't exist. Well, actually, the number 1 is the only number that does exist, because a lot of the universe is quantized. So individuals, particles, do exist, but any number higher than 1, we've made up.
Well, one, I think that if you were to affirm the existence of a single unit within a quantitative reality, then you would have to affirm that there could be the number 2 as well, since that would imply unity.
But that would be
could be
the number 2.
You've gone into the.
So I mean, that is literally that is a priori, right? Like 1 + 1. So if I have one thing, it's like if Jim has 1 apple and Mary has an apple, then we could say that there are two apples.
Yeah, we can say that, but what we're going into the conditional means of thinking there. We can say that they're two apples, but the universe doesn't know that. The apples don't know that. What we have done is we have taken our concept of two-ness as if it's a hoop in a hoopla stall, and we've plonked it down over two apples and said, there you are.
Well, I think that this is a mistake, primarily because I think if you start affirming, if you start affirming the non-existence of a priori concepts within reality, then the experience of reality will quickly fall apart. That's Kant's response to David Hume. So what you're affirming here is essentially a form of nominalism, where these are nominal essences. Well, the issue with nominalism is that it leads to the a priori synthetic divide. And the a priori synthetic divide, as Immanuel Kant showed, leads to an inability to have a describable experience. You no longer have, one, a knowledge of the experience, but two, you no longer have the experience. The experience itself is, first and foremost, unified by a relationship, for example, with space and time. If you didn't apply, for example, if the experience didn't already come with applied a priori concepts of space and time, you would be unable to distinguish between the inside of your head and the outside reality from which you are perceiving, to even affirm that there's an external world. You'd be unable to have linear quantitative measurements. So you wouldn't have a notion of psychological continuity, for you would even say that one event could have constant conjunction with another event, because you would be unable to distinguish the two events. So to even be able to say that there is evidence that is synthetic, you are going to have to affirm an a priori notion of truth.
But what you're talking about there is entirely within a cranium. Describable. You said you wouldn't be able to describe things. That's a mental construct. You said that you wouldn't be able to. What was your description of? You wouldn't be able to have the thoughts. You wouldn't be able to do the assembly intellectually, and of course you wouldn't. But that's only fabricated in here. It doesn't have any effect at all on what's out there.
I think that the point is, for you to even affirm that there isn't out there in the first place, you've already applied these concepts. You've already distinguished, even in terms of geometric distinction, even from a Euclidean standpoint. Look at it like this: if you were to affirm that no a priori concepts were to be made available to a point of categorizing what is a qualitative reality, then you wouldn't be able to say that there was a thing in general. You wouldn't be able to affirm that there is the number one external. You wouldn't be able to affirm that there is a physical reality. The concept of physicality would be alien to you. You wouldn't have any of these things. And even if it was the case that these exist, you would be epistemologically alienated from that. So that would be what Kant would call the noumena, which means that you wouldn't be able to describe it in any way, shape, or form. You wouldn't be able to attribute any notion of evidence to it. So what he actually argues is that we necessarily live in the phenomena. We always live in the categorized a priori synthetic reality. And I would affirm that we necessarily have to have a unity between a priori and synthetic concepts to even have the experience of reality in the first place that you would denote evidence to.
So what you have described there is what we do inside our heads. You've used the word affirm twice, attribute, and say. None of this has any impact on the natural realm whatsoever.
Okay, then what is the natural realm?
It's observable features, phenomena that are outside of the head.
Phenomena? What do you mean by phenomena?
I mean material objects and sources of energy.
What do you mean by material?
Well, these material means made of matter.
What do you mean by matter?
Yeah, well, this is the trouble with philosophy. You see, it's reductivism.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. I was going to ask Lewis. listening to all of this, listening to the whole conversation, firstly, would you see yourself as a presuppositionalist? That's the first
Absolutely
thing.
not.
Absolutely not. Okay, well, it sounds to me a lot like you are. But the other thing that I want to ask is, what is the purpose of having this type of discussion? Because we all know, as people, as people living in the world, experiencing things, when we say that this is a pair of glasses, whether I'm sitting here, whether you are here, my 6-year-old can walk in and say, this is a pair of glasses. And I don't think there is something to discuss about that. We have to live
Oh,
like that
I
in the
agree.
real world.
I agree
The
that there is
question
a
that I
point.
wanted,
Sorry, I don't mean to be rude.
what I wanted to ask is, well, I'm of the opinion, you said Kant showed this and Hegel showed this. I
Yes.
don't think that philosophers can show anything. I think philosophers can talk about ideas, they can express ideas, and we can learn a lot, and they can steer us in our thinking. But I don't think one can say that Kant has showed us this in the same sense that somebody like Louis Pasteur showed us what the germ theory of disease is.
Oh, I completely disagree.
I don't think it's possible. I think it becomes, it very quickly derails into some sort of mental masturbation. And I wonder, I always wonder what the purpose is. And when I talk about, so I would like to ask you, what do you think is the purpose of philosophy to the person who sleeps on the street tonight, in whether it's in London or anywhere else in the world for that matter? What is the purpose of philosophy to that person?
I would say philosophy is fundamentally the pursuit of truth, and encompassed in that is a plethora of various fields which can benefit humanity as a whole in a myriad of different ways. A person on the streets, obviously, you could equally respond with what is, for example, quantum mechanics. How is that valuable to someone who lives on the
Exactly,
street?
I agree.
Yeah,
You could.
see, I do think that it
Except
is
that,
valuable in relation to society and how it affects that individual. For example, if we take something, let's take nuclear physics. Actually, let's take something which is clearly not the concern of someone on the street, but the ability to produce a society to produce energy is vitally important for the economy, as we're seeing right now. And if you don't want to sleep on the streets, I think you genuinely want a good economy. I think that just because something is abstract and not necessarily applicable to one's immediate circumstances at all times doesn't mean that it's not necessarily valuable. I think that sciences are very much like that. For example, I don't think very many people care whether a quantum computer is made, but there are a lot of people who also care about whether a quantum computer is made and who makes it first, depending upon national security. And if you don't want to get necessarily invaded by an enemy force, that might be useful. And so when we look at how subjects and overall how learning and knowledge acquisition works as a society, I don't have to learn everything and you don't have to learn everything, but together we can learn a considerable amount more, which will bring value to our lives. I think specifically how philosophy could help the individual living on the streets is in a few different ways. I think that the individual living on the streets may have, for example, made some bad choices in their life, and they may have, through maybe no fault of their own, or maybe through direct fault of their own, ended up in a very precarious situation. Philosophy gives you the critical thinking capabilities to analyze the situation you're in and call it into question, to reconcile yourself with your own actions. Which is why, I mean, to be entirely honest with you, even the separation between philosophy and the natural sciences is a relatively new development. Prior to, I think it was the 1700s, they used to be called natural philosophers, and the notion of and the notion of the acquisition of knowledge in relation to one's synthetic experience isn't necessarily alien from the intellectual pursuits from which you called mental masturbation.
So one of
Absolutely.
the problems that I have with the way that philosophy has evolved is that the divide, the remove between philosophy and natural philosophy that we now call science, I think there's too much of a divide, and it is reinforced in the way that subjects are taught at school. And I think we should move back to the idea of natural philosophy as science, and that would be my proposition. So
Well, I think that's what we
yeah.
already do, though. I do think that's what we already have. I don't think that philosophy has moved away from science at all. I think science tries to move itself away from philosophy often. I don't think there's very many scientists who are reading philosophical papers and in relation to their own subjects, like, for example, the philosophy of science. But the vast majority of philosophers are scientific realists, for example.
I hear John wants to say something.
Yeah, I didn't know whether he stopped or frozen. Sorry, Lewis.
No, it's okay.
Well, yeah, no, I don't want to rubbish philosophy because, of course, it is the foundation of science. We need to use logic. In fact, I may have been saying this before you arrived, Lewis. I'm not sure whether we'd started streaming then or not, but I'll repeat it in case because you're now here. We need logic, we need rational thought in order to come up with hypotheses that enable us to look beyond current knowledge and investigate the boundaries of understanding. And we also need logic and rational thinking in order to be able to design investigations that will enable us to work out which of those hypotheses is correct, or a good model or not. And the trouble, as I see it, is that particularly keen amateur philosophers that I meet, they're theists really, but I meet them on social media a lot, and they think that they've finished when they've come to the end of their reasoning. They think that that's
No
the
doubt.
job.
No doubt. Yeah, I completely agree. I meet these people as well. Yeah.
You meet them too, don't you?
Yeah.
I call them pre-Renaissance philosophers because they haven't noticed that natural philosophy was thought up back then, and that they don't realize that every thought needs to be tested for congruence with observations in the natural realm. So I have a lot of arguments with them on that basis.
I mean, I don't think that would even be pre-Renaissance, right? I mean, if you look at the history, for example, of even theological approaches to knowledge, there was the relationship between testability with the external world was huge in philosophers. I mean, Francis Bacon was a Christian philosopher who arguably came up with the first foundations of the scientific method. So,
and Stone Age man Og came up with the first scientific experiment when he made fire. I didn't really want to.
I'm just saying that I don't think it's even a pre-Renaissance view. I think that it's the primary. I think what you're talking about. I think one with presuppositionalism that was mentioned earlier. I think that is obviously that's a plague to humanity. My God, it is one of the worst things I've ever come across. And unfortunately, there are a fair few Christian presuppositionalists where they just essentially esoterically enforce their views as like, well, I assume the existence of a God and then go from that point on, which is absolutely absurd.
Yes,
and
absolutely. Well,
and on the other hand, I think that I actually know quite a few atheist presuppositionalists as well, for that matter. But there's I think the main issue is what is often a kind of Neoplatonism is also quite foundational within Christian approaches, and there is this rejection of the forms existing within the particular. And I think that what you would affirm as a theistic approach, I would say as a particular theistic approach, rather than essentially encompassing the variations of theists that do exist. Many of us affirm the natural sciences.
It's always dangerous to generalize. Sure. Yeah.
So Lewis, when you said that, I accept that you're not a presuppositionalist, but I'm still curious as to what would you cite as evidence for the existence of God. And can philosophy do that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. I think that the arguments are outlined primarily in Hegel's Science of Logic. I think it's a really solid position to take from. I think that it's not necessarily an ontological argument in the sense of it being something akin to Anselm or Descartes. It is similar, though, in the sense that Hegel starts us off with what is indubitable, as in like what simply cannot be doubted, and then builds up from there. And the indubitable reality is reality in its most simple form. Now, Hegel would say this, well, Kant would say this in many ways, was what Hegel would consider, what Kant would consider the noumena, rather. Hegel would see as immediate existence, the qualitative experience. That would be the universality of what we would consider quality, just our being here. This is where Hegel would start us from. So when we're engaging in any investigation, it is our experience and our investigation into the world that is foundational. Then you have to think about the kinds of judgments that you can make and its relationship to reality. The relationship between truth, is with thought and reality. And so that truth is essentially what he would consider the foundation of being itself. Reality is observing itself. We are a subject observing an object, for example. We are an individual observing other individuals who are also engaged in an ontic enterprise, essentially analyzing being. And how we categorize that being is in relation to the concepts in our minds, but it's also in relation to what is conceivable about those objects. And this is where you end up with what's called the fittingness of the concept. And so Hegel's saying that we, unlike Kant, where it's all just made up in our heads, where like this a priori structure, we necessarily end up in this subjective realm where we can't have knowledge necessarily of the world that we exist in, or a common world. Instead, we're stuck in a subjective realm. Hegel's saying that no, there are these objective concepts of that we can test against, and it is fundamentally one defending science. That's why it's called the science of logic. It's a fundamental defense of deductive reasoning in relation to scientific enterprise.
He's answered your question of what is matter then, because he recognizes that there are objects out there. There are objective things, and we're subjectively observing them. Is this why you've called your channel Perspective Philosophy, Lewis? Because you recognize that we are all receiving stimuli of various sorts through our senses, and thanks to technology, through lots of different sorts of detecting pieces of instrument, and then we process them in here, and at that point they get smooshed up together with our preconceptions, our personal biases, and so on. Is that why? That's our perspective. Is that why you called your channel Perspective Philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, very much so. But at the same time, I do think that through perspective that we do what is it? Truth is structured like a fiction. Like when we reconcile ourselves with reality, our perspectives can then be called true or false. So it's not to say that there is that when we engage through a subjective framework that we're always false, for example, but rather that we necessarily need to work through a logical, we need to work through our reasoning and our logic and see reality as it is, rather than how we would like it to be, or rather than how we think it is, or how it even appears to us. It's kind of like when Teresa said, if we all affirm these glasses exist, and why should I would not consider that in my day-to-day life. The whole point of what Hegel would be arguing is that, well, that's true. Yes, there is we could say that there is a seeming or an appearance to this, but that these are built from my categories of understanding. But whether my categories of understanding are correct in relation to this seeming is vitally important, specifically in the natural sciences, where just because I don't see the air, for example, doesn't mean it's not there. Just because I don't see reality as for example, just because I don't see time dilate doesn't mean that it isn't dilating, in relation to the relative motion of a body. And I think that this is kind of the point of testability that I think is being affirmed in the Hegelian approach, and it is the unity of the two a priori with the a priori synthetic. Like, the belief structure that you have in your head about the world is obtaining reality, and if you say that it doesn't obtain reality, if you split those concepts that you have in your head from reality, you are alienating yourself from truth.
Well, now there's another can of worms there. Let me just first of all agree with you about I don't know whether it was your thought or Hegel's collective repeatable observations. That's as close as we can come to objectivity, because everything that goes on inside our heads is tainted by our minds, and so it's inevitably interpreted. But if we get lots of people doing the same experiment and getting the same observation, then on the basis that you can't fool everybody all the time, we're probably getting somewhere close to objectivity, although absolute objectivity is probably unavailable. What do you think?
I don't know if absolute objectivity is unavailable. I think that would mean that absolute truth was unavailable. And although I am a fallibilist in the sense that I do think that we can have uncertain but true positions, to say that we are alienated from absolute truth, I think, is a step too far. I think that it is, whether we will achieve it or not is questionable, but whether it is achievable is a different position to hold.
Yeah, well,
so talk about truth. How would you define truth?
I would say justified true belief free of relevant falsehood.
Yes. Well, I wanted to get, that's another show talking about truth.
like truth as a 1-to-1 ratio between reality and a belief. I would say, like you say, like this belief is true. But I would say knowledge, would be a justified true belief free of relevant falsehood.
Well, thereby hangs the tale, because we almost know for certain, as far as we can, that reality is relative, not absolute. And therefore, truth can only be absolute in our thoughts, where anything
No, I mean, that's quite opposite, actually. I mean, truth necessarily has to be absolute external to our thoughts, but our thoughts being adequate is the relativity that's involved. It is our inadequacy. It's not the inadequacy of reality which alienates us from truth in terms of psychological bias. It's not as if there is a defect in an atom when we observe it, when we construct an atomic model which is inadequate. It's that we haven't constructed the model correctly, or that our concept of the atom doesn't necessarily pertain to the object itself perfectly.
Well, now that's expecting reality to be frozen, not changing. And
no, I mean, you could say that reality is absolutely changing. I mean, you could take the philosophy of, for example, Heraclitus, where everything's in flux. Everything's in a constant state of motion, yet you can know the logos, the logical mechanism which underpins how things change. So you could say that reality is entirely changing, but you could still have truth.
Well, you can have truth conceptually. I mean, you can conceive of the E equals mc squared, which is, that's a description of reality. But
which covers relative states in relation to bodies of motion, for example. Yeah,
and recognizes that everything is relative.
Well, it recognizes that that certain things are relative, not everything necessarily. For example, the maths which creates it's not relative.
Well, the maths are only in here. You see, maths didn't exist before humans.
Well, I would disagree. I would say that that numbers do exist in reality. I would say that what we are doing is aligning the concepts, the a priori concepts within our minds, with the ones that exist in reality. There are various fields of physics which even one are totally dependent upon that. I'd say all science is totally dependent upon that. If maths didn't pertain to reality, then our ability to make valid predictions would be based off consequential luck. And induction. And I think that the whole point of the Kantian refutation of David Hume was to defend the Newtonian physics of the day against the problem of induction. And this is why I think that philosophers such as Robert Brandom say that analytic philosophy which affirms that the problem of induction hasn't been solved, needs to remove itself from its Humean phase. I think this is a problem that is, to be entirely honest with you, only observable within the English-speaking world.
Well, go into space and come back with a 3.
I mean, there are numbers all around us. I think that information theory would argue for that.
No, there aren't. No, they're only there when we apply them.
Okay, if we want to say that, what is matter without, we'll go back to what is matter, and we're going to talk about how we can define a synthetic object without applying an a priori concept. So, for example, theologians, I know that you don't necessarily give much credit to philosophical theologians, but let's take the theologian, or even we'll take one of the forefathers of science, let's say Aristotle, argued that matter itself wasn't a thing. That matter, that what we call the prime matter without form, would not necessarily exist. So, like, let's take matter. If I was to say, well, what is matter? Could you give me an example? If we were to just try and boil it down to its raw constituents.
Sure, it's material which occupies space, which has measurable properties like weight, or rather mass, and electrical charge. Sometimes it might have a temperature. These are empirically discernible properties. That's matter.
Okay, I would agree in the sense that I do actually think that matter exists. But let's take those measurable points. One being measurable is the existence of an a priori numerical foundation within reality that this actually does occur.
Well,
but even if we were to let's just take, for example, the existence of matter in itself. What is being measured here? What is it that we are measuring?
It doesn't have to be quantifiable. We don't need thermometers to feel heat.
Well, I mean, what is our feeling of heat?
The quality
if it isn't a measurement.
The quality is there without our imposition of numbers on it.
Like, I mean, we could have a for example, I could trick you psychologically into thinking that you could put like 2 neurons into your brain, right, and make you possibly experience heat. Like, you could, I'm really hot. You could be freezing cold, right?
Sure.
Yes, but that wouldn't be.
But that's not what we mean in science, is it? By heat.
No, it's external, isn't it? So we're detecting it from somewhere.
What we mean by heat is kinetic energy, right?
Yeah, motion of molecules. Okay.
Yeah, and then what's that? What is the motion of molecules? Sorry, Teresa.
No, I'm just thinking that heat or the absence of coldness is something we can measure, but that's just a property of matter. I mean, what about, there are different matter has different properties that can be measured, but the fact whether we can measure it or not doesn't mean, if we can't measure it, it doesn't stop existing.
Well, I would agree. But for us to affirm,
I would, with my science background, I would just say matter is atoms. That
atoms.
And
what's an atom?
What would the quantum physicists say about that? I mean, you can drill down and down and down and down, but but then
no, but I mean, like, fundamentally, I mean, that's what we're going to have to do. I mean, this is the basis of your worldview, not mine. So from a physicalist point of view, I'm just wondering how you are going to affirm the existence of any of this without mathematics, right? You're going to have to. Well, no, I thought a priori concepts don't pertain to reality.
No. Are you saying that because Og, our famous Stone Age man, hadn't invented mathematics, he couldn't recognize matter?
No, whether the mathematics, or whether it actually exists in reality, whether a priori concepts exist in reality, or whether it's like, so this is the issue that I think, I don't know if have you read David Hume at all?
A bit, yeah.
Okay, so
I haven't read Hume. I've listened to people who have read Hume, a variety of them. Because I have to confess that reading philosophers is extremely hard work. And often because many philosophers are not clear communicators. In fact, in preparation for tonight's show, knowing that you're a proponent of Hegel, I mean, I've
Hegel's the
heard
worst. Hegel's the worst.
Even philosophers say that Hegel is almost impossible to understand.
I mean, you've got to dedicate yourself to Hegel. I think that's the thing, and it was an issue with the time. It's even an issue I think that was brought up by what's the very famous Russian author, and he takes the mick out of the German philosophers of the day. I can't remember his name now, but yeah, it's a known issue with certain philosophers, specifically the Romantic Germans are awful.
Even somebody like Alain de Botton says that Hegel is very, very difficult to understand, and that brings me to the whole question of yes, we can sit here and we can discuss, and it is important. It has to be discussed because it has led us to the science that we have today. It is because of natural philosophy that we today know about something like quantum physics, because somebody imagined that could be possible, and we have devised and I mean, something like a bacteria was unimaginable to people living 500 years ago. But then, because people could imagine that there were such small things, that we discovered them, but we only discovered them because somebody like Antonie van Leeuwenhoek, who was a linen merchant, decided that he lived in a material world where he needed to count the threads of a table to determine its value in the economy of the day. And whether or not I can define what an atom is or what matter is not irrelevant. It is important. It needs to be discussed. But we can all recognize that in our day-to-day life, in the physical world that we live in, there are certain things that we know are like this, and this operates like in a particular way. And
but I mean, you can have like a load of dogmatism that can be inherent within people who get around life absolutely fine. I mean, I'm pretty sure there's a load of Christians who believe that, you know, Satan implanted the bones of dinosaurs, put them go to their 9-to-5 job, put meals on their table, and they still live life absolutely fine. That doesn't mean that they're still dogmatic and they're wrong. Like, would you not agree?
Yes, but what I'm saying is that whether we are still having to learn things about what atoms are, and we are still learning what atoms are. There's a lot
I'm not
of
putting
things
into question your empirical observation and your capacity to understand these things. What I'm calling into question is your ability to define them without the use of an a priori foundation. Like, for example, even your ability to use induction, right, as a means of acquiring knowledge. For example,
this is the problem, isn't it? This is because philosophers, I'm generalizing again, damn. Philosophy tends to expect absoluteness, and therefore induction fails. But in fact, it works well enough. I mean, there's a...
Oh, no, that's not why induction fails. Induction isn't judged by philosophers because of its inability to have, like, to show, like, without a measure of falsity. I mean, that's not why induction fails. Like, for example, induction fails because in terms that it's being asserted. Like, unless you can have a foundation for that as a rational approach to gaining knowledge, you have no reason to believe that it actually is helping you gain knowledge. For example, you can have what's called counter-induction. So counter-induction is the opposite of induction. It is every time the constant conjunction of events means that it's likely to not reoccur. And that if it's esoteric would be equally as likely. And that's the issue. How do we approach?
Yes. At this point, you see, I would challenge the a priori philosophy, that paradigm, because...
But that's what induction is.
Well, but what it seems to expect is that we should be able to reason why it works. That puts thought above observation. Now, the truth is the other way around. Observation is stuff that's real out there, and thought is the way we try to model it.
So if I give you a hallucinogen, there's a dragon in the room. You start tripping that there's a dragon in the room. There is a dragon in the room.
Specifically, that's an anecdote. What science requires is repeatability, and from independent viewing points, so that we can have consensus of expert opinion based on observing the same phenomenon.
But we can observe the same. We could all observe the same phenomenon and yet still be wrong.
Theoretically, we could all have the same hallucination.
And that's not even mentioning the fact that in how we categorize and understand that experience is a priori itself. That's what Kant really shows. Your ability to categorize it in the first place is specific.
We could all sit in the audience and be fooled by the same conjurer. But
can I ask a question here? So if somehow the entire world could be given at this exactly the same, every single person alive is given the exact same hallucinogenic substance, and we all see exactly the same image appear, a dragon, right? So in this thought experiment, we're all giving the same dragon, we all see the same dragon at exactly the same time. Then all of us would be correct in saying that we all see a red dragon.
Well, yeah. That doesn't mean there is a red dragon, though. That's the separation between seeming and truth.
Exactly. But at that moment in time, when we all see a red dragon, if all of us see the red dragon, then we are all seeing a red dragon.
Yeah, but you're right now affirming a separation between what is observable and what is truth, which is exactly what John was arguing against.
Yeah, because I would want to do the control experiment in which some people don't get the drug.
Exactly.
Yeah, but you're relying upon one. It's not about them necessarily being given a drug. It's whether even human faculties of observation can properly categorize the world, right? Just because we can't see more than 3 dimensions doesn't mean that they don't exist. For example, right? Like there is the world as it appears, and then there is the world as it is. And so, like, there is the ability to correct our categorical processes. It's not just through observation; it's through necessarily understanding what is occurring. For example, if you look at the CERN the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, the way that we approach that isn't simply to just observe. We observe, and then we extrapolate the amount of energy released in relation to our conceptions of things like gravity, and in relation to dimensions that may and may not exist. And this is how we approach it. We approach it through an a priori process.
Well, absolutely. This is because the human senses are disturbingly limited. But fortunately, we've invented a lot of instruments that can take our perception, our observations further.
Yeah, but it's not simply about observing. It's about correctly observing and correctly categorizing. But the categorical process is in and of itself. Yes, it's in relation to reality, and I completely agree that there is a reality that we necessarily must observe and try to understand. But it is through our categorical process that we even have a reality that's observable.
Furthermore, you said something earlier about we've got a level of probability that we accept as true, or some words to similar effect. And I would agree with you. In fact, you bring up CERN, and the instruments that do the detection for us there have a statistical threshold that we've set for them to cover. And we accept it's not absolute, but we accept that it's 95% likely that the Higgs boson exists.
Yeah. I mean, 100%. And then we'll try to lower that as much as we can. Like, obviously, the uncertainty is as low as possible. And that's part of the scientific approach, which I absolutely affirm. I would like to point out that I'm right now affirming science. And I would say that the position, to be honest, that I think you two are affirming is anti-scientific. I think that when you take a position which is nominalism or based upon induction without actually affirming the foundations of this, or without affirming, for example, the existence of a priori concepts within reality, then you're alienating yourself from scientific truth, which is a priori synthetic.
I disagree there, you see, because I think science is justified a posteriori. because it works, bitches, as Richard Dawkins famously
I say
said.
something?
But you have to be able to give criterion from which to consider as it works, working and failing at the same time. I mean, this is all mathematic. The language of science is maths.
Yeah, so.
Well,
I think that's fairly important.
What I would say, so
okay, we've invented a great tool.
All right, if I was to just reinvent it, like, you can't just say we invented it and how, do you really think that if I was to change all of the logical inferences to be their inverse, right, that the equations wouldn't matter in terms of how we calculate, for example, the kinetic energy of particles to measure heat? You don't think that would matter?
But we didn't know that at one time. We invented the maths to express.
Just because we didn't mean it. Just because we didn't know it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
It doesn't.
Absolutely.
That's true. But the invention of it, not the discovery, the invention of it is listed against the names of people like Newton, who came up with some of the maths that helped them to.
And philosophers such as Leibniz,
Leibniz, describe what they observed. And of course, we now know that Newton's laws are not very absolute. They're certainly not. They're not.
Newton famously said, "Sorry, Teresa,
they're not the best model."
But they worked up to a point, and they worked very well. And in many aspects of the reality that we find ourselves in, they still work really, really well, which is why we still use them. So, what I would like to push back on the the comment that John and I are anti-science. So I
think is, just to be clear, I don't think that you are against science and its endeavors. I think you misunderstand science.
I get that. No, I understand. That's the way I understand it. But which is entirely possible, because I am the way I see science working is to use the example that you said, that the fact that we can't see a fifth dimension, so the fact that we can only see 3 dimensions, or observe 3 dimensions, does not mean that there are 50 or 5 or 12 dimensions. But the approach to reality that I subscribe to is, I'm not going to say that there are only 3 dimensions because I can only observe or experience 3 dimensions. But if somebody comes and says there are in fact 23 dimensions, then I will require them to give some sort of evidence for those 23 dimensions that can be observed directly, indirectly, through deduction. And I think that's just the way I see science. And that brings me back to the question that all of this started with, is what is the evidence for a God?
Yeah, the reason I think that we ended up on this tangent.
That's what I'm still missing.
Yeah, that's fair enough. The reason that I think we went on this tangent was specifically in relation to John's point, which was that a priori knowledge is something that simply is a fabrication, where I'm affirming that a priori knowledge can show necessary truths, and that those necessary truths can pertain to reality, which is what John was dismissing. And I think that when you do dismiss that, one, I think it leads to an unscientific paradigm in which you necessarily assert so for example, with inductive reasoning in and of itself, you could say that the constant conjoining of events as you have seen them has led to a conclusion which many of us would consider implausible, but that you should still affirm. That's not even considering alternative views of reasoning, such as counter-induction. And the only reason that what is happening here is that you are brute forcing an inductive model of reality, which is essentially unfounded and dogmatic, and it's ironically, it's very similar to those who would brute force a notion of God. I think both approaches are necessarily incorrect. I think that the reason I would affirm the existence of a God a priori isn't necessarily to say, okay, there is I'm going to affirm that God exists. I'm going to take what I'm saying is that Hegel is arguing from what is an indubitable indubitable logical relationship between reality and in itself, which is truth, and that God is truth. Then that truth is mental. I'm an idealist, So I believe that the world is fundamentally not fundamentally physical, but that what we understand as physical reality is in and of itself an ideal, and that this ideal is the relationship between a priori, which we would consider, most of us would consider mental, which is why it's idealism, a priori structures, things like 1 + 1 = 2, numerical reality, notions of forms, for example, and the external world. I think that these structures necessarily exist in the external world, and that's why I would affirm the existence of an a priori synthetic reality. And that's that. So I would be what's called an objective idealist or an absolute idealist. And so what I'm affirming is that truth, the relationship between these structures, these logical structures, necessarily must exist, and that this is a mental state. That this is a mental, what we would consider a mentality, knowing of oneself.
Right. So coming from my point of view, what it seems to me you've just said is that you affirm, that is, you've made a choice in your brain, that the existence of a God is a truth, which is, not demonstrating the
no, not a truth. That's
okay. But you've made a choice. Anyway, I wanted to, I've overspilled, this is FreeThought Hour, but I've overspilled deliberately because I know that you were unavoidably detained.
Yeah, I'm very sorry about that.
No, don't worry. No, we all suffer traffic jams. Yeah, that's one of the truths.
It is. Indubitable.
Yeah. So anyway, I've enjoyed it, and I hope you have too, Lewis. We've had a couple of engaged audience members. Thank you guys, for joining in with us. And this will become a podcast the minute I press the button. So thank you very much.
If anyone wants to hear me flesh out, because obviously I only gave the very bare bones of the Hegelian position, which is essentially to affirm the most fundamental basis of reality there, which is just you can see more perspective philosophy. But it is a much more complex argument which spans about 600 pages of the book.
Well, so, Lewis, can I ask, please don't go away when we stop the live feed, because I would just like to ask you one question before. Just
absolutely.
5 minutes. Don't just go away before I say goodbye.
No problem.
Or we could invite him back and say it then.
We will have to, but I need to just have one.
You need to have an answer to that now, do you? Okay. Right.
I can't wait. Maybe I'm not here tomorrow.
Well, we never know that. Luckily today I woke up. That's one benefit, or one blessing. Can I say blessing? Oh no. Okay. Thanks, guys, and thank you, viewers, both present and future. Say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.